I worked as an investigative journalist for the New York Times, and I still have colleagues that are there, and they are quite blunt about the fact that investigative journalism into the inner workings of power have been frozen completely because of wholesale surveillance. And government officials, because they know they're monitored, journalists, because they know they're monitored, can no longer shine a light into the inner workings of power. The only mechanism left by which we can understand, frankly, the crimes that are being committed by the powerful, by the elites, are through leaks. That's what Jeremy Hammond did, and I used the leaks that he provided, the 5 million emails from Stratfor, in my own lawsuit against Barack Obama. They were actually pivotal because there was an exchange between a member of the Homeland Security and the private security firm trying to find a jihadist website that had referred to or linked to a group called Days of Rage, which is about election reform, and was included eventually as one of the plaintiffs in my case, so that they could charge them with terrorism laws. The whole exposure of the material that Chelsea Manning leaked, the war crimes that were leaked, the duplicity of Hillary Clinton in her campaign, and there's a long list. Joe may have gone over it. I mean, everything from promoting Trump as the candidate to taking in 3 speeches over $600,000 from Goldman Sachs, a sum so large it can be only described as a bribe. The use of the Democratic National Committee to thwart the Sanders campaign. And when Joe was on my show, he was talking about how, and also that exposed how New York Times reporters were having their material vetted. Her two-faced, very hypocritical stance, saying one thing to Wall Street and another thing to the voters. Does the public have a right to know this stuff? And as somebody who, throughout my career, 15 of them with the New York Times, often published classified material, that is the mechanism by which we hold the powerful accountable. Take that mechanism away, and tyranny, corruption runs rampant, as of course it is at the moment. So this case is, with Julian, extremely important, not only because he's being persecuted for what in a democratic society is laudable, but also because of the implications it will have down the road. So the Trump administration will use this legal precedent without question towards more mainstream publications, which, as Joe said, have turned their back very short-sightedly on Julian. But yeah, I think that the bankruptcy of the institutions, including the press, the failure of the court system to have any kind of real independence, certainly the American court system is a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state, means that all we have left is what we have seen in the streets of Paris, and it works. I mean, people forget that it's not just Macron, but it was Sarkozy, who was a complete cretin, was really held in check by the French labor unions, the French farmers, the students, and this. The French have a history of this kind of militancy. We used to have it many decades ago. It was really wiped out quite effectively, but we have to regain it. It's the only tool we have left to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. Ray, you want to weigh in on that?
Just to say amen, amen, amen.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, Chris, how, I can't ask you this because there's really no answer, but what would it take to spur that kind of reaction from the American people like we see in France? France is totally different. They react. Sarkozy began this neoliberal
Right.
British-American policy that began with Thatcher and Reagan, and that the French had resisted. Even Mitterrand still had nationalized banks, this type of thing. There was a kind of a socialism in France, and they resisted this Anglo-American economic system, but it has wholly taken over France, and particularly now with Macron being appointed essentially by bankers to lead the country. So, and the French people there, they know their interests, and they've just had them reverse a policy simply because they were on the streets. How could we envision this happening here? How could this happen here? What would have to happen?
Well, part of the problem is the complete corruption of the systems of information, not just the press, but academia, the shutting out of all critical voices. I mean, that's why you have public broadcasting, so that people are not beholden to the power elites, to business interests, have a voice. Now, because I think PBS gets only 18% of its funding from the federal government, they depend. I mean, literally, the Koch brothers are a huge contributor to public television. And this has sanitized the airwaves. So, you know, the whole idea of myself as being some kind of a radical critic is nuts. But it shows you how perverted the environment is, that, you know, I'm basically a Swedish socialist, you know, 1970s Swedish socialist. I'm, you know, a Keynesian. I had I gave a talk at the University of Winnipeg, and the head of the economics department got up as soon as I finished and said, he's just a radical Keynesian. Canada is still a healthy academic environment. You know, the fact that voices like mine or yours or Ray's or anyone else are essentially shut out, I mean, you know, is extremely disturbing, and shows you how degraded systems of information have become. And I would have to say the electronic systems of information, I mean, CNN, MSNBC, it's all info entertainment. It's all court gossip. There's no journalism done anymore. And that's why they can't pay. That's number one, why their approval ratings are so low among the American public, and they deserve to be. But secondly, why they can't penetrate that kind of hardcore 40% around Trump, because all they do is sit like courtiers at Versailles and talk about, you know, which mistress Louis XIV took into the bedchamber, and ignore the real suffering that has been inflicted on, at this point, over half the country that's living in poverty or near poverty. And I really look at this bankrupt, self-identified liberal elite as responsible for the rise of these proto-fascist movements. We see it in Germany with Merkel. We see it in Hungary. We see it in Poland. We see it with Nigel Farage, Le Pen. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, it's the figures like Macron who, in the end, empower these fiercely anti-democratic movements, because they have surrendered to international bankers and corporate power, abandoning the citizenry, and by doing that, they have eviscerated the rule of law. I talked to Ralph Nader quite a bit, but I remember Ralph saying to me a while ago, you know, in the end, people like you and me are actually conservatives, because on the political spectrum, because what we are calling is for the restoration of the rule of law. And what we are seeing with the persecution of Julian is a shredding, a destruction of the rule of law, which is vital to maintaining an open society.
And it could very well backfire on them, particularly in the media. And it's by design. It's a very good point you made about the Koch brothers. I mean, that was, from their point of view, a brilliant move to go in there and neutralize PBS by essentially taking it over. And
well, they fund the news. They fund the NewsHour, which is why it's so boring. I mean, it's good if you have insomnia.
But the liberal class, as you point out, is very much responsible for this by taking on these neoliberal economic policies to destitute so many people. They are creating the backlash that we're now seeing, and we have no organized popular left to rise up as well, or in place of, or at least alongside of, this popular right. So we're in a really tough situation here to
Yeah, it's very different from the 1930s. I mean, and certainly different from the turn of the century when the United States had powerful socialist, anarchist, communist, militant labor unions, the anarcho-syndicalists like the Wobblies. And we forget the press, too. The press was extremely diversified. Appeal to Reason, which was a socialist newspaper, Debs wrote it for it, had the fourth highest circulation in the country. It was a very different, and the consolidation of systems of information into the hands of a few corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Sinclair, all of whom have, narrowed the acceptable range of opinions, kind of what Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress. It goes from A to B. And that's kind of what you see in the press. So there's no debate about endless war. There's no debate about the fact that we've lost the war in Afghanistan, the creation of failed states. It's all about tactics. Do we just bomb Syria, or do we bomb Syria and put boots on the ground? As if those are the two alternatives in terms of dealing with the Assad regime. So it's nuts. But it's stunted and destroyed. I mean, it's left really quite it's robbed people of the vocabulary by which they can even ask the question. And of course, that's the intent.
And of course, the liberal class will never blame themselves for having a major role in creating this situation. They'll blame Julian Assange, WikiLeaks, the Russians, anybody but themselves.
Right. And then you get Hillary Clinton trotting off to Europe, thinking she can outright the far right by saying you should build more walls to keep immigrants out. I mean, just the utter bankruptcy of the Democratic Party and the self-identified, because they're not really liberals, the self-identified liberal establishment on display recently with Michelle Obama's banal memoir. I mean, I watched the same thing happened in Yugoslavia with the death of Tito, and the mismanagement and the inability to be effective in terms of addressing the social inequality and eventually the economic breakdown of Yugoslavia. It vomited up these figures like Radovan Karadzic, just the way we vomited up Trump or Orban in Hungary or Boris Johnson in Britain or anywhere else. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. I can't remember who said that. It may have been Mark Twain. But it's true. I mean, you have to learn from the past. The fact that the fascists in Weimar in 1928 were polling in the single digits. Then you have the 1929 crash. Ebert and the Social Democrats, the kind of liberal establishment of their day, caters to the international banking system and imposes draconian forms of austerity, including abolishing unemployment insurance. And that, of course, gave rise to the Nazi Party. As every historian, Kershaw, Evans, and anyone else who's written on that period has pointed out, when you create that economic distress, that social stagnation, that rupturing of social bonds, that inability to actualize yourself within the society for a life of meaning and dignity, then you get these dark pathologies which express themselves in a myriad of ways. My latest book, America, the Farewell Tour, looks at them: the opioid crisis, suicide, gambling, but also these dark political pathologies are a consequence of every decayed society. And when you look at decaying societies, and you can go all the way back, I study classics, you can go all the way back to ancient Rome or even Greece, then you find the same kinds of distortions. I mean, the idea that you can maintain a democracy in an oligarchic system, this is something that Aristotle addressed, a few thousand years ago. And he fully understood that once you create an oligarchic system, your choice is either revolution or tyranny. And we've reached that point. That's where we are.
And unlike in Weimar, as you were pointing out earlier, while the liberal bourgeois class was responsible for a lot of the failure, there was a obviously very vibrant left-wing Marxist, socialist demonstrations, fighting in the street with the Nazis. they were the real threat that many think the big business in Germany needed the Nazis to help put down.
Well, that's what. Sure,
but we don't have that now.
No, we don't. We don't.
We have this right-wing popular. Who's going to go on the street for Julian then? Will we see right-wing populists doing that if there's no left-wing mobilization for this purpose? Would we want that?
Yeah. I mean, you have a libertarian element that on issues like this, they're good. I mean, at this point, it would have to be something that would erupt like the yellow vest, that there's just a kind of spontaneous eruption. Whether that will happen for Julian is problematic. We're certainly barreling towards another economic crisis. And we're watching the volatility now in the stock market, which is absurdly valued because companies are valued for projected profits. And that's the whole goes back to the .com industry, but the fracking industry, which doesn't make any money, the Google, Apple, they're all valued on projected. They're not real. It's not real. And there's nothing about stock price being actually tied to value. So, and they're gambling, just like they did before. It's an economy built where they are extracting money primarily from debt peonage. They don't create anything, not in the traditional capitalist way. So we're at a very volatile and dangerous moment. But I think that unfortunately, on the issue of Julian, for many people who are sitting with their mouths half open watching Basketball Wives, I don't have a TV, so I don't know what people watch now. This moment is extremely dangerous, but it's abstract in a way that economic suffering, economic punishment is not. They don't always know why it's happening, why there is an economic collapse, but it affects them immediately and directly, and this will affect them, but it's not immediate and it's not direct.
Susie?
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts on that front, actually. So just one thing quickly with relating to the DNC publications, something that very few people realize, but if they actually go in and read the documents that WikiLeaks published, they'll discover that WikiLeaks did publish information that was detrimental to the Trump campaign because they published the entire DNC opposition research on Trump, which included all of the super PAC information, the donors. I've studied it myself. I've learned a great deal about who Trump rubs shoulders with and who he accepts money from as a result of those publications. So it's actually untrue. It's just simply untrue that WikiLeaks was selective in their publishing of those files. There is plenty of information about Trump in WikiLeaks. Simply go in and type Trump and press enter. There's mountains of stuff. Similarly, there is mountains of information that is detrimental to Russia. And I say that sitting in Russia. There's 660,000 files about Russia that have been published by WikiLeaks. There is information about security operations, about security companies. If you really wanted to study, for the purpose of even Trump or Russia, you would have a better chance at finding valuable information about them in WikiLeaks than you would in almost any other publication. But the media don't want to tell you that. They don't want you using WikiLeaks. So most people do not realize that at all. But WikiLeaks has made everybody who has power and wealth fair game, no matter what country they're from and no matter what political affiliation they have. And that just takes me back, Joe, to your question. I can see Ray smiling at me, so I know he knows about this. Joe, your question a moment ago about, do we want the Tommy Robinson crowd in the streets in the UK? Are we going to see that? And I would say to that poverty has no ideology. No matter what people's political affiliations or beliefs are, they are uniformly victimized by poverty and by the social circumstances which Chris is describing. And we actually have several of our core team who are in France and who are French and who have been caught up in the recent events in France. And what they are reporting to us is that everybody is in the streets. It is not a left wing, not a right wing. It is a class war. And that class warfare is those who are hurting versus those who are not. And it's almost like adherence to a rigid political ideology or affiliation is a manifestation of privilege. That when you have the privilege of determining who you will align yourself with based on ideological grounds, that is a privilege of comfort. But when you get to the level that we are seeing these people at, that flies out the window. They just want food. They just want social services, healthcare and education. They don't care whether it is the left or the right or whoever is going to give it to them. They just want it, and they want it now. And when you get to that level of desperation, I think these rigid ideological lines, the divisions that we've seen particularly manifest in the US since 2016, but also that have been the perpetuation of divide and conquer agendas for generations, specifically to keep people separate and so that they can't realize their full power en masse, the way we've seen in France recently. I think if people get desperate enough, if people get to the point where they understand that the struggle of Julian and WikiLeaks is inherently interlinked with the struggles of the 99% against the 1%, that then yes, we may well see the Tommy Robinson crowd on the streets, but we'll see them beside the Catholic workers, we'll see them beside the socialists, and that may be what gives us the critical mass that we need. And in some ways, that's what this movement and the work that we've done over the last 6 months has been about, which is saying that fighting for Julian is the important thing. Julian and WikiLeaks, I've said it before, but I'll say it again, they are the bulwark that has protected the entire independent media sphere. They have created a vacuum that has allowed many of us to operate in. There is 800 intelligence agents working every day, probably more than if you include private subcontractors, to take down Julian and WikiLeaks. And if they are successful, I'm sure they'll have a hell of a party, but the next day they will begin work on their next targets, and there will be next targets. They will not give up and go home. And so it is in all of our interests to protect Julian and WikiLeaks and to keep that bulwark in place.
I think everything you say is right, is very true, and I think that's part of the problem with the ideological purity among the left in the United States, that we are going to have to make alliances over basic social and economic issues with people whose politics are not like ours, maybe even repugnant to ours. That said, when societies break down, Marx writes about it, there is always, that was his anger towards what he called the lumpen proletariat. There is always that segment of the society that will willingly do the dirty work of the state. That's who fascists are. That's who the Basiji were when I covered Iran. They're always there, and the state essentially empowers them to carry out extrajudicial violence, and they are an element that we are going to have to deal with, especially in the United States, given the proliferation of weapons and the rise of militarized hate groups, which are all over the place. And of course, it's short-sighted because the thing that has driven them into the arms of these proto-fascist organizations is the same economic distress that has affected everybody else. But the ruling elites in times of social unrest and economic turmoil throughout history have always been quite good at empowering those elements. And as Joe said, when the business community, which finds Trump an embarrassment, but when they feel under the pressure, they will always make alliances with these fascist forces. Many people forget that it was the Social Democrats that created the Freikorps to break the Spartacus uprising and the uprisings on the left in the 1920s in Germany, which was the antecedent that became the Nazi Party, and that's what. And that's why the liberal class is always so dangerous. Gramsci also got it, as so did Luxemburg, because that bourgeois liberal element in times of distress, however unpalatable and unsavory it may be, will always side with the fascists.
Yeah, the thing is, I see fascists on both sides, because coming through Occupy, we were targeted by Hillary Clinton's State Department. We were targeted by Obama's administration. I watched myself and many other activists have our lives completely dismantled and ruined by the security state, which Trump has inherited and which Trump may wield now. So I see to me, Trump is just a mafia family, and Clinton is a mafia family, and it's the competition of the mafia family. So I don't put a whole lot of stock in them. I just think it's really a puppet show personally. But particularly having studied the Snowden files, I look beneath and I see 20 years of NSA strategizing, and they are strategizing for a global network. That's what they call it, their global network. And they fully intend to, and have to a certain degree been successful at controlling every single element of human society, whether it's education, whether it's the technology sector and the strategic development of technology, and to what degree that's become accessible to the public, to information and media systems, to economics. They have what they call the Global Economic Security Day, where they work with all of the global economic interests under the guise of security. So this is it's an international fascist machine that is it's an architecture, it's an infrastructure that is to a certain degree wielded by whichever political faction happens to be in power. But in those same NSA documents, they actually describe themselves as being impervious to political perturbations brought about by whoever the population chooses to vote for in any given 4 or 8 year cycle. So they are fully aware of their own omnipotence in that regard. And that is why, in the counterinsurgency doctrine, the political sphere is just one pillar, the security sphere is another, and the economics is the third. And the only thing that can topple all three pillars is the foundation, which is information. And so WikiLeaks has attacked that base of all three pillars. They have gone after the banks, they've gone after the economic pillar, they've gone after the CIA and the security pillar, and they've gone after the political. And that is what has made WikiLeaks so dangerous, because they are the first organization to threaten all three fundamental pillars of what I consider to be truly fascist global system of control.
Pay to play on the regular. You kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioner.